When I first laid my hands on his bare back, it was meant to be nothing more than a mother's instinct to help. His physiotherapist had cancelled last minute, and he was in pain, so I did what any mother would do, right? I found an old bottle of oil in the cabinet, the one I hadn't touched in years, the scent faintly reminding me of another time, another life. He lay down on the couch without a word, trusting me completely, as he always had. But the moment my palms met his skin, something shifted. Not in him, in me. My breath faltered, just for a second. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did and chose silence. I told myself it was the tension in my fingers, the ache in my wrists, that's why they trembled. I told myself this was care. But deep down, even then, I knew I had crossed an invisible line, a line I had no right to even approach. Later that night, I stood in front of the mirror, washing my hands over and over, and yet his warmth clung to my skin like memory. I stared at my reflection, at the woman I thought I was, and I didn't recognize her. Not because I felt guilty, no, that would have been easier. What I felt was fear. Fear of myself. And if you've ever felt that, the creeping dread that the danger isn't outside, but inside you, then maybe you'll understand. So let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the moment everything unraveled, leave a comment with your city and tell me this: have you ever looked at someone you weren't supposed to and felt something you couldn't control? He came home limping, one hand gripping the frame of the front door like it was the only thing holding him up. I was in the kitchen, rinsing out a glass, and the sound of it slipping from his fingers to the floor startled me more than it should have. The glass didn't break. Neither did I. But something cracked, somewhere deep, like a tiny seam in my bones. I rushed over, of course I did. My first instinct was the one I'd always had: help, support, fix. I asked what happened. He shrugged. Nothing bad. Training accident. His voice was light, dismissive. But his wince as he shifted his weight said otherwise. He hadn't been living with us for over a year. College, dorm life, independence, all the things I was proud of and mourned in silence. But now he was back, if only temporarily. The house, which had grown so quiet with just me and my husband, mostly me really, since he was always traveling, felt immediately different. Not noisier. Just warmer. My husband was already out of town. Business trip. Just a few days, he'd said. But I'd heard that before. I didn't even ask this time when he'd be back. I offered to make dinner. My son declined. He looked exhausted. His room was already made up. I had done that the week before, when he said he might visit. I told myself it was motherly preparation, not anticipation. He went upstairs to rest. I stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the stairs long after he'd disappeared at the top, before retreating to the kitchen. The faucet dripped rhythmically. I turned it off, too forcefully. My heart was beating a little too fast, and I didn't like that I noticed. The next day, he limped into the kitchen around noon. He looked like he hadn't slept. His back was stiff. He couldn't reach down without wincing. I offered to call someone. A physiotherapist. He said he already had one, but the session had been cancelled. I nodded, but something inside me moved before I could stop it. Do you want me to try? I asked. My voice felt foreign in my throat. He looked at me for a second, not with suspicion, just surprise. You know how to do that? A little, I lied. Years ago, I had taken a workshop. For my husband. But he never asked for it again. I still had the oils somewhere in the linen cabinet. Lavender and something else. Something warm. He agreed without hesitation. That should have made it easier. It didn't. I set up a blanket on the couch in the living room. The sun was just beginning to dip, casting long orange beams through the curtains. He lay face down, shirtless, trusting me completely. That trust was like a knife. I uncapped the oil. The scent hit me all at once, sweet, musky, sharp. I warmed it in my hands, and then I touched him. At first, it was all mechanics. Shoulder blades, lower spine, pressure points. He exhaled with relief, his body relaxing under my touch. That should have been a comfort. But instead, I felt something else, the tension building, not easing. My hands moved with practiced motions, but inside, my thoughts scattered like birds startled from a wire. I wasn't thinking of his injury anymore. I was thinking of warmth. Of skin. Of silence. I told myself to stop several times, quietly, internally. But I didn't. Not right away. Because there was nothing overtly wrong about what I was doing. Nothing anyone could point to and say, there. That moment. But I knew. I knew the moment wasn't about muscles or pain relief anymore. It was about proximity. He shifted, slightly, murmuring something about how good it felt. My hands paused. He didn't notice. Or didn't comment. I continued. When it was over, I handed him a towel. He sat up, winced again, then smiled. Thanks. Seriously. I nodded, forcing my voice to sound even. Of course. He left the room. I stayed behind, cleaning up the bottle, folding the towel. My hands smelled like the oil. I couldn't stop smelling them. Later that night, after he went to bed, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time. The light was harsh. I looked tired. Older. But my skin was flushed. My eyes too bright. I didn't like what I saw, not because I looked ugly, but because I looked alive. I washed my hands, then washed them again. And again. The scent wouldn't leave. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall. My phone buzzed, my husband, probably, sending an update from the airport or hotel. I didn't check. I lay down fully dressed and stared at the ceiling. The silence was thick. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. And deep beneath it, something inside me was changing. Something I didn't want. Something I didn't know how to stop. The morning after that first massage arrived with a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years, not the peaceful kind, but the sort that lingers after something has shifted, even if no one says it aloud. The house wasn't any different, yet everything felt strange. I moved through the kitchen as if it were unfamiliar, every drawer I opened giving me pause, every object I touched reminding me that my own hands had betrayed me. I tried to act normal. Made coffee. Toasted bread. Buttered it with methodical care as though the routine could anchor me. But my thoughts kept drifting to last night, not just to what I did, but how I felt. The heat that surged under my skin when I touched him, the uninvited thrill of his body relaxing under my hands, the smell of oil that still lingered in the fabric of my robe. I kept waiting for shame to arrive and stay, but instead, it came in waves, quick, shallow, and then gone, replaced by confusion. He came down later than usual. His hair was a mess, his eyes half-lidded with sleep. There was no awkwardness on his face. No accusation, no confusion, no signal that he'd felt what I had. Morning, he said simply, pouring himself a glass of water. Did you sleep well? I asked. My voice was steady. Too steady. He nodded, then winced a little as he leaned against the counter. Yeah. Still sore, but better. I watched him from the side, trying to decipher every motion, every word. But he was calm. Maybe for him, it had really been just a massage. Maybe everything else had only happened in my head. I wanted to believe that. I needed to. The rest of the morning passed quietly. He went back upstairs, said he had an online class to catch. I stayed downstairs and busied myself with chores that didn't need doing, reorganizing the pantry, wiping windows that weren't dirty, anything to avoid sitting still. By early afternoon, I could no longer pretend to be occupied. I told him I was heading into town to run errands. He barely looked up from his laptop, just nodded and said, "Okay." The drive into the city was uneventful, but my thoughts wouldn't stop unraveling. I parked near a small cafe I used to visit before the pandemic changed everything, before life became quieter, slower, and lonelier. I sat at a corner table by the window and ordered tea, not because I wanted it but because I didn't know what else to do. Outside, the world moved at its usual rhythm. Cars passed. People walked, chatted, carried their bags and babies and burdens. Inside, I was frozen in a moment that hadn't even truly happened, at least not the way I feared it had. I sipped the tea. It was too hot. I barely noticed. At the table next to me, a couple in their 30s was arguing. Not loudly, but with that simmering tension that said this wasn't their first fight. She was biting her nail, he was looking everywhere but at her. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I knew this dance. Misunderstanding. Distance. Silence stretched too far. And yet, as I watched them, a strange pang moved through me, not envy, not quite, but something close. I envied the immediacy of their emotions. The rawness. The fact that whatever pain they were in, it was out in the open, not twisted up inside, hidden under the guise of normalcy. I paid the bill and left. Walked for a while without purpose. The streets were familiar but didn't offer comfort. I stopped by a store, browsed shelves of skincare products, and left without buying anything. By the time I returned home, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the windows. The house was still. I climbed the stairs slowly. His door was ajar. He was lying on his side, facing away from the door, earbuds in. I didn't enter. I just stood there for a moment, unseen, watching the quiet rise and fall of his shoulders. Later, when I was preparing dinner, he came down, sat at the counter, and scrolled through his phone. The air between us was thin, delicate. I didn't know how to move in it. "I'm going to need another session," he said, not looking up. I dropped the knife, not loudly, but with enough clatter that it startled both of us. He looked up, confused. "You okay?" I nodded quickly. "Yes. Just, wasn't expecting that." "Sorry." "I thought it helped," he said, voice careful now. "It did," I replied, my back to him. "It did help." Dinner was quiet. We talked about the weather, his class, whether I still had almond milk in the fridge. None of it mattered. Every word felt like a wall built between what we were saying and what we weren't. Afterward, I cleaned the dishes while he returned upstairs. My hands moved on autopilot. In my head, I was reliving that moment, his body under my hands, the silence, the breathlessness. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the covers too heavy and not heavy enough. I thought about waking my husband, calling him, hearing his voice, letting it ground me. But what would I even say? Instead, I got up, walked to the guest bathroom, and rummaged through the old cabinet. The oil was still there. The label slightly peeled, but intact. I opened it. The scent hit me like a whisper I couldn't ignore. I stood there for a long time, holding the bottle, trying to remember when everything became so fragile. The next day would come. And with it, another decision. But tonight, I was still here, between what had been and what might be. Suspended. Waiting. Trying not to feel. I woke before the sun did. The house was still, heavy with that kind of silence only the early hours know. The kind that feels more like a presence than an absence. I stayed in bed, staring at the outline of the ceiling, unsure whether I had actually slept at all. My body felt like it had been through something, even though nothing had really happened. At least, nothing visible. Eventually, I got up and walked barefoot to the kitchen. The tile floor was cold, grounding. I filled the kettle, waiting for it to boil. The mundane act brought a strange comfort. It gave my hands something to do, my mind something to hold on to. When the tea was ready, I sat at the table with the mug cupped in both hands, watching the steam curl upward like a silent question. I had no answers. I replayed yesterday in my mind, not like a memory, but like a movie I couldn't stop watching. I tried to pinpoint the exact moment where everything shifted, but it wasn't one moment. It was accumulation. A slow build of glances, gestures, pauses. I didn't know if he remembered it the way I did. That thought scared me more than anything. If he did, and said nothing, what did that mean? If he didn't, then who was I becoming? The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled me out of my thoughts. I turned slightly, pretending to be absorbed in my tea. He entered the kitchen with that casual sleepiness unique to youth, the slow, deliberate pace of someone unhurried by consequence. He said good morning, and I returned the greeting with a smile that felt practiced. He reached for the cereal, the milk, and sat across from me. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of spoons and mugs and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Then, without lifting his eyes, he asked, "Do you think you could help again? With the massage?" My breath caught, just slightly. He didn't notice. Or pretended not to. "I mean, only if it's not too much trouble," he added quickly, like he realized something mid-sentence. I set my mug down carefully. Too carefully. "Of course," I said, and smiled again. This time, it felt less steady. He nodded, finished his breakfast, and disappeared upstairs. The rest of the day unfolded slowly, like a sheet being pulled across a bed you didn't want to make. I kept myself busy, laundry, emails, watering the plants. I took longer than usual arranging the living room. Folding the throw blanket, fluffing the pillows, lighting a candle I hadn't touched in months. Lavender and cedar. Subtle, but present. When he came down, the sun was low again. It always seemed to be late afternoon now, as if time was conspiring to trap us in the same golden hour over and over. He lay on his stomach. Shirt off. I sat beside him, the oil already warmed in my hands. This time, I started slower. More deliberately. I told myself to focus. On the muscles, on the movement, on anything but the heat rising beneath my skin. But the silence was intimate. And every breath he took felt synchronized with my own. I pressed into his shoulders, and he exhaled deeply, murmuring something like gratitude. I didn't respond. As I worked down his spine, I noticed how relaxed he was, how comfortable. Too comfortable. My hands hovered for a moment, just for a breath, before continuing. I told myself again this was fine. Just relief. Just routine. Just touch. But nothing about it felt neutral. I found myself watching his face, the way his brows softened, the way his mouth parted slightly with each movement. I hated that I noticed. Hated even more that I didn't look away. When it was over, he turned onto his side slowly. Not toward me, but not fully away either. Our eyes met for only a second. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. He thanked me again and left the room. I stayed behind. I wiped my hands. Tidied the pillows. Blew out the candle. everything in slow motion, like moving through water. Later that night, I stood in the hallway outside his room. I had no reason to be there. I told myself I was checking the thermostat. But I wasn't. His door was cracked open slightly, and I could hear him on the phone. Not loud enough to make out words, but the tone was light. Easy. He laughed once, and something about that laugh hurt. I retreated to my bedroom and closed the door. I lay on top of the covers, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling again. The same one. The same silence. At some point, I got up and went to the bathroom. I splashed water on my face, stared at myself in the mirror. I looked tired. Not just physically, something deeper. Like my soul had spent the day bracing against something I couldn't name. Back in the bedroom, I sat at my desk and opened the drawer where I kept old photographs. I pulled out a few of me and my husband, from vacations, holidays, anniversaries. I studied them, one by one. We looked happy. We were happy. So why did I feel so hollow now? I picked up a photo of the three of us, my husband, my son, and me. A picnic in spring. Our arms around each other. All smiles. I touched the edge of it, gently, as if it could still warm me. But it didn't. It was just paper. Just memory. And something had already changed. Not out there. Inside. Quietly, steadily, without permission. The following morning brought with it a strange stillness. Not quiet, not peace, but a suspension. Like the air in the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I moved through it carefully, as though any sudden motion might shatter whatever fragile line we were tiptoeing along. I busied myself with laundry. His clothes were mixed in with mine, and as I folded them, I noticed things I hadn't before: the scent of his detergent, the faint wear at the seams of his t-shirts, the way one of his sweatshirts still smelled faintly of the cologne he used in high school. These were details I wasn't supposed to linger on, but I did. His bedroom door was open, but I didn't glance inside. I didn't need to. I already knew too much about how it felt to be in a room with him, too close, too careful, too uncertain. By midday, I decided to leave the house. I didn't say anything to him. I just grabbed my purse, my keys, and walked out. The city wasn't far, and I needed air that didn't belong to the same rooms we shared. I drove with the windows down, letting the wind tear through my thoughts. I parked near a bookstore I hadn't visited in months and wandered inside. It was quiet, save for the soft hum of music and the gentle flipping of pages. I wandered between the aisles, touching the spines of books without reading the titles. I wanted to disappear into something, a story, a memory, anything that wasn't mine. I ended up in the self-help section. I wasn't looking for it. It just happened. I stood in front of a shelf labeled Boundaries and stared at the word until it blurred. A young couple passed by me, laughing about something only they understood. I envied their ease, their ability to be seen together in public, to be close without fear. When I returned home, it was late afternoon. The house was as I left it, still, quiet, pulsing. I found him in the backyard, sitting in the sun with a book open on his lap. He didn't hear me at first. I stood in the doorway, watching him, unsure whether to step outside or disappear again. He looked up eventually, squinting against the light. "Hey," he said, and smiled, just a little. I nodded, but didn't move. "I thought you were out for the day," he added. "I needed air," I said. He closed the book and stretched, wincing slightly. My back's stiff again. The way he said it wasn't casual. It wasn't heavy either. It just was. I hesitated, but only briefly. "All right," I said. "Let's do it inside. It's getting cold." The massage happened in his bedroom this time. Not the living room, not the neutral space of public comfort. His room. His bed. I asked him to lie down, and he did. Shirt off. Back exposed. Trusting. I warmed the oil again. My hands shook slightly, but I hid it. The light was softer in his room, more forgiving. But nothing about this felt forgiving. As I touched him, something inside me shifted. I no longer felt like I was helping. I no longer felt like I could call this care. I was aware of every breath, every sound, every millimeter of skin beneath my hands. He didn't speak. Neither did I. There was no need. At one point, he moved his arm slightly and his fingers brushed against my knee. The contact was so brief, so light, it could have been dismissed. But neither of us moved away. I finished the massage and sat back, suddenly exhausted. He turned his head toward me, resting his cheek on the pillow, eyes half-lidded. "Thanks," he said quietly. I nodded. "Of course." I stood, wiped my hands, and left the room without looking back. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. My chest rose and fell too quickly. My palms still tingled. I didn't know what to call what was happening. I didn't have words for it. But I knew it wasn't sustainable. Something had to give. That evening, I pulled out old photo albums. I needed something solid, something to remind me of who I used to be. I flipped through pictures of birthdays, holidays, vacations. Smiles captured in still moments that now felt like fiction. I found one of him age 6, running through the yard in a cape, barefoot, laughing. My heart ached in a way I couldn't describe. I wasn't just mourning time. I was mourning simplicity. Back then, I never questioned my role. I never questioned myself. I closed the album and returned it to the shelf. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the kitchen window, staring into the dark. The glass was cold in my hand. My reflection stared back at me, older, quieter, harder to recognize. The front door creaked. I turned. He was walking down the hallway, his steps slow. "I'm going for a walk," he said, not quite looking at me. I nodded. "Be careful." "I will." He left. The door closed behind him. And I stood there, frozen, wondering if I should have said something more. Something that might have stopped this train before it derailed. But I didn't. I just watched the street through the glass and waited for the shape of him to disappear into the night. The next morning came with a strange sense of order. The kind that follows days of emotional turbulence, where everything feels slightly too neat, too rehearsed, as if pretending to be normal might convince the world that nothing is broken. I went through the motions, made breakfast, watered the plants, opened the curtains, all with mechanical precision. I didn't know where he had gone the night before, but I heard him come in around midnight. I hadn't gotten out of bed. I had just listened to the quiet sound of the door clicking shut, his footsteps in the hallway, the rustle of fabric as he moved through the dark. It had been enough. Now, as the house filled with morning light, I tried to carry myself with ease. Tried to make my footsteps light, my movements smooth, my voice casual. I brewed coffee and poured it into 2 mugs, placing his beside his usual seat at the kitchen island. He came down a few minutes later, hair damp from the shower, a hoodie pulled loosely over his frame. He mumbled a greeting and sat down silently, sipping from the mug I had prepared. We didn't look at each other for a long time. At some point, I asked if he wanted eggs. He said he wasn't hungry. The silence between us wasn't hostile. It wasn't even cold. It was something else entirely, thick, uncertain, filled with questions neither of us knew how to form. He finished his coffee and stood. For a second, I thought he was going to leave the room without another word. But then he turned slightly, eyes still on the floor, and asked, "Can we talk?" I nodded. My hands tightened around my mug. "About what?" I said, though I already knew. "About the other day," he replied. I don't want things to be weird." I nodded again, slower this time. "It's okay," I said. "We're okay." He looked at me finally. There was hesitation in his gaze, but something else too, something that made my chest tighten. "I didn't mean to cross any lines," he said. My voice was quiet. "Neither did I." There was a pause. One long enough to swallow any chance of returning to the safety of unspoken things. Then, we kissed. It was brief. Soft. As if neither of us fully committed to the moment. And yet, once it happened, everything inside me shifted again. He pulled back first. Said nothing. Walked away. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, heart pounding, palms sweating, my mug of coffee long gone cold. The rest of the day passed in a kind of daze. I didn't go anywhere. I didn't call anyone. I didn't check my phone more than once. I moved around the house like a ghost, cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, rearranging books, staring out the window. The weather changed in the afternoon. Clouds rolled in, gray and low, making everything feel even more closed in. I watched the sky darken and thought about leaving. About packing a small bag and disappearing for a night, or longer. Just to put distance between myself and the truth that had begun to grow roots in my own home. But I didn't leave. I stayed. He remained upstairs for most of the day. I heard movement, drawers opening, music playing faintly, the soft creak of the floorboards. But he didn't come down, and I didn't go up. Dinner was quiet. We sat across from each other at the table, the spaces between our words filled with the memory of what had happened. I made soup. He complimented it. That was the extent of our conversation. Afterwards, he helped me with the dishes. Our hands brushed once, briefly, and neither of us reacted. But I felt it in every nerve. Later that night, I stood in the hallway, staring at the door to his room. My fingers hovered near the knob for a moment, then curled into a fist. I turned away. I went into my bedroom and locked the door behind me. I told myself it was for safety. For space. For clarity. But it felt like surrender. I sat on the edge of the bed, then lay down on top of the blanket, fully clothed. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. I thought about what it meant, that moment in the kitchen. That small act that should never have happened. That could never be undone. I thought about the way he looked at me, the way he didn't flinch. And I thought about myself, who I was becoming, who I used to be, who I could never be again. I felt a kind of quiet panic settle in my chest. Not sharp, not loud, but deep, a slow, aching realization that I had reached a place there was no easy return from. In the dark, I heard a floorboard creak. Not in my room. In the hallway. I stayed still. Said nothing. Eventually, the sound faded. I turned to face the wall and waited for morning. The next day unfolded slowly, with the kind of inertia that makes even the smallest tasks feel heavy. I stayed in bed longer than usual, letting the light from the window trace patterns on the ceiling while my thoughts drifted between half-formed decisions and sharp flashes of memory. I kept waiting for clarity, for guilt, for something decisive to rise to the surface, but instead, I felt blank. Numb. Downstairs, the kitchen felt foreign. I stood for a while staring at the cabinets, forgetting what I had come in for. Eventually, I made coffee, poured it, let it cool untouched. He didn't come down until late morning. His steps on the stairs were hesitant, careful, not because he was physically sore, but because the silence between us had become dense enough to wade through. He entered the kitchen with the quiet of someone walking into a room he no longer fully belonged in. We exchanged the kind of pleasantries that make no one feel better. Weather. Sleep. A nod toward routine. Nothing that touched the real subject that sat heavily between us. I offered breakfast, and he declined again. Said he had things to do. Said he might go out for a bit. I told him that was fine. The conversation ended there. The rest of the day, I found myself glancing at the clock more often than necessary. I kept track of his footsteps, the sound of the front door opening and closing, the faint noise of his car starting. Each sound etched itself into me like a note in a composition I didn't want to hear but couldn't ignore. By late afternoon, the house was quiet again. I took that as a cue to move, to do something, anything, that might feel like control. I went into the laundry room, not because anything needed washing, but because folding clothes had always given me the illusion of structure. I found one of his sweatshirts at the bottom of the basket. I held it longer than I should have, pressing the fabric between my fingers, recognizing the shape of his presence even in something so ordinary. I placed it on top of the pile and moved on. Evening approached with the same soft menace as the previous days. Shadows stretched through the windows, elongating the furniture, making everything look slightly off-kilter. I made dinner more for the sake of appearances than appetite: pasta, salad, garlic bread. When he came back, he lingered in the entryway for a moment, as if unsure whether to remove his shoes or leave again. Eventually, he came into the kitchen. I gestured toward the table. "I made dinner," I said. My voice was too even. "Thanks," he said, sitting down. We ate in near silence. Forks against plates. Water glasses being set down. The occasional glance across the table that lingered just a second too long. When the meal was over, I stood to clear the dishes, and he moved to help without a word. Our hands worked side by side, and I found myself aware of the rhythm of our movements, the way we had done this countless times over the years. Only now, it felt entirely different. After everything was cleaned and put away, I stood by the sink, looking out the window into the dark yard. "I might go for a walk," he said quietly. I turned to face him. "Be careful." He nodded. "I will." But he didn't move. Instead, he stood there, a few feet away, waiting. I didn't ask what for. I already knew. It was as if we had reached a point where turning away would be more unnatural than continuing forward. There was no plan. No logic. No justification left to hide behind. Just two people, suspended in a moment neither had asked for but couldn't retreat from. When he finally stepped closer, I didn't stop him. I didn't step back. I closed my eyes for a moment. My heart beat so loudly I thought it might betray me. What happened next felt like gravity, not decision, not desire, just inevitability. We spent the night together. The details don't matter. They never did. What mattered was the silence afterward. The stillness of the house. The way the night wrapped around us, not like comfort, but like confession. He fell asleep first. I stayed awake, watching the shadows move across the ceiling. Every breath he took was a reminder of the boundary I had crossed. When the sun began to rise, I slipped out of the room and went into the bathroom. I stood in front of the mirror, blinking against the pale morning light. I looked older. Tired. But calm. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't feel much of anything at all. Back in the kitchen, I made coffee the way I always did. Poured it into the same mug. Took the same seat by the window. Only now, everything looked different. Because it was. The light coming through the kitchen windows had a sharpness to it, the kind that only appears after a night where nothing felt clean. I sat with my hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee, though I wasn't drinking it. I just needed something to hold. Something to pretend was steady. The silence in the house wasn't just silence anymore, it was a blanket of awareness that clung to every object, every wall, every breath. I hadn't gone back to sleep. After I left his room, I had walked the hallway like a ghost, my bare feet silent on the hardwood. I thought, for a moment, about packing a bag and leaving. Just stepping out the door and walking until my legs gave out. But I stayed. Not because it was right, but because it was too late for anything else. I heard him moving upstairs. The floorboards creaked in that familiar way, but now even the sound of his footsteps felt louder than before. I didn't look up when he entered the kitchen, but I knew he was standing in the doorway. I could feel his presence before he said anything. He walked past me, opened a cabinet, poured himself some coffee without a word. He sat across from me, and for a few seconds we were just two people at a table again. Two people pretending to know what came next. But I didn't. Neither did he. I looked at him briefly. His eyes were tired. Not just from lack of sleep, there was something behind them now, something raw and searching. We didn't talk about it. He finished his coffee and stood. "I'm gonna take a drive," he said. His voice was quiet, even. I nodded. Okay. He left. The sound of the door closing felt like punctuation. I stood and walked to the sink, rinsed my mug, and stared out the window. The yard was still, the grass wet with dew, the trees gently swaying in the wind. Everything outside was unbothered. Everything outside was as it should be. I moved through the house slowly after that. Tidying. Folding. Rearranging small things that didn't need to be moved. I dusted the shelves even though they were already clean. I wiped down counters, restacked books, changed pillowcases. Anything to give my hands purpose. In the afternoon, I decided to cook. Not because I was hungry, I wasn't, but because the rhythm of chopping, stirring, measuring felt manageable. I peeled potatoes, diced onions, let the scent of garlic fill the kitchen. I turned on the radio, something soft and forgettable, just to drown out the silence. The phone rang. I stared at it for a long time before answering. It was my husband. He sounded cheerful. Tired, but cheerful. He said his meetings were wrapping up early and he might be able to come home a day or two sooner than planned. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, not because I couldn't hear him, I could, but because I didn't want to miss any nuance in his voice. Any suspicion. Any doubt. But there was none. He asked how everything was. I told him things were fine. I asked how he was sleeping. He said the hotel bed was too soft. We laughed. I said I missed him. He said he missed me too. We hung up, and I stood there holding the phone in my hand, staring at the blank screen. When he returned, it would all change. Or maybe nothing would. Maybe I would change, and no one would know. Maybe I had already changed too much to pretend I hadn't. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the half-prepared dinner. The smell of roasted vegetables and herbs filled the air, but it felt meaningless. He came home just after sunset. I heard the car before I saw the headlights. I stood by the window and watched him walk from the driveway to the front steps, his shoulders tense. He didn't come in right away. I heard the car door close, but the front door stayed shut. A full minute passed before he finally entered. His eyes met mine briefly as he walked into the kitchen. He said nothing, just looked at the food on the stove. "You cooked," he said eventually. "I needed something to do," I replied. He nodded, then sat. I served the plates. We ate in silence. Halfway through, he spoke. I've been thinking. I paused, fork in midair. About what? He looked at me, not with accusation, but with something softer, curiosity, maybe. Or hesitation. About leaving. Just for a bit. A trip. Time away. I blinked. Where would you go? I don't know yet, he said. Somewhere quiet. I set my fork down. Do you think that would help? He shrugged. I don't know. But something has to. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was heavy, yes, but not suffocating. More like a space that needed to be made before anything honest could fit into it. He stood and started clearing the dishes without waiting for me to offer. I joined him, and for a few minutes, we moved around each other like we used to, smoothly, efficiently, without much thought. But everything inside me was humming. After the kitchen was clean, he said he was going to shower. I nodded. He left. I sat alone for a long time, listening to the water run upstairs. I let my thoughts drift, dangerously so, to the night before, to his eyes, his hand brushing mine. To the quiet in the room after. I didn't know what was right anymore. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Eventually, the water stopped. The floor creaked above me. I stayed downstairs. I turned off the lights. Sat in the dark. And waited. The morning began with a sharp sound, the front door unlocking, the creak of the hinges, and the unmistakable weight of someone entering the house. I was in the kitchen, still in my robe, pouring water into the kettle when I heard his voice. Not my son's. My husband's. He said my name with his usual cadence, not knowing that every syllable landed like a stone. I froze for a moment. The water overflowed slightly, splashing onto my hand, but I didn't flinch. I just turned off the stove and wiped the counter slowly, as if I hadn't just felt the entire house shift beneath my feet. I came back early, he said, stepping into the kitchen with his bag still over his shoulder, his travel jacket unzipped. Meetings wrapped sooner than expected. He was smiling. I managed something resembling a smile in return. I didn't expect you until tomorrow night. He walked over and kissed my cheek, and I let him. His cologne was different than usual, something fresher, unfamiliar. A hotel sampler, maybe. I noticed details too quickly now, with too much weight. He set his bag down and began talking about flights, delays, weather, the unbearable man who sat next to him on the plane. I nodded in the right places. Repeated what I'd heard. Replied with just enough warmth to pass for routine. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. Subtle. Measured. Paused halfway down. I felt the temperature in my body shift. My husband glanced toward the stairs but said nothing. He wasn't the type to assume. Or maybe he was just too tired. He poured himself coffee, commenting on how good it smelled. The silence between us stretched. A moment later, my son appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed, composed, his hand running through his hair like he had done it 100 times before school as a teenager. He descended slowly, meeting his father's eyes with practiced ease. Hey, he said, casual. My husband smiled broadly. There he is. Didn't expect to see you here, thought you were back in the dorms by now. I came home after the injury, my son replied, and walked toward the counter to grab a banana. Back's still bothering me. They exchanged pleasantries. My son made a few comments about classes. My husband laughed at something, then turned to me to ask if we had eggs in the fridge. It felt surreal, all three of us in the same kitchen, engaging in the dance of normalcy as if nothing had changed. But everything had. every movement, every word, every breath carried weight beneath it. Subtext. We sat down to eat. Toast, fruit, coffee. The sounds of clinking silverware were louder than they should have been. At one point, my husband placed his hand gently over mine and asked, "Are you okay? You seem quiet." I nodded. "Just tired." He squeezed my hand. "I missed you." I looked at him for a long second before replying, "I missed you too." And I had. In a way. In the way you miss safety, structure, the rules you once knew and understood. Later, as he unpacked his bag upstairs, I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes with more focus than necessary. My son lingered near the doorway, silent. When I turned to face him, he didn't look away. "He doesn't know," he said under his breath. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My hands were wet. I dried them slowly, deliberately. "He thinks everything's normal," he added. I finally met his eyes. "Isn't that what we want?" He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. He looked tired, older somehow, like the last few days had pulled something out of him. Or maybe he was seeing me differently now, not as mother, not as caretaker, but as the sum of choices he couldn't undo. He left the room without another word. The rest of the day moved in fragments. My husband was upbeat, unaware. He asked about the garden, the neighborhood, whether we should finally take that trip we'd always talked about. I smiled, nodded, agreed. I played the part one knew better than any other. I played it so well that even I believed it for a while. We had dinner together that evening. The three of us. The meal was simple, roasted chicken and vegetables, a bottle of wine I'd been saving. My husband toasted to family and we clinked glasses with forced ease. I watched them talk. Father and son. Comfortable. Unknowing. My stomach turned. After dinner, I excused myself and went to the bedroom. Closed the door. Stood in the center of the room and listened to the sounds from below, laughter, footsteps, the muffled buzz of the television. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. They looked the same as always. Worn. Familiar. But I didn't trust them anymore. I picked up my phone, opened my messages, and stared at the blank screen for a long time. I typed out a message to no one. I don't know who I am anymore. I didn't send it. I deleted it. Later that night, my husband came into the bedroom, tired from the trip, ready for sleep. He kissed me on the forehead and crawled into bed beside me. His body curled instinctively around mine. I lay stiffly, unsure of how to breathe. "Good to be home," he whispered before drifting off. I stayed awake. I watched the numbers change on the digital clock, minute after minute, hour after hour. At some point in the night, I slipped out of bed and walked down the hallway. I didn't knock. I didn't speak. But I stood outside his door for a long time, until my feet ached and my heart quieted into something that resembled resolve. Then I turned around and walked away. The next morning began before I opened my eyes. The sounds were already there, the shuffle of socks across the hallway floor, the low creak of the stairs, the kettle switching on in the kitchen. Life had resumed as if nothing had changed. But inside me, everything had. I lay still for a while, listening, not moving, barely breathing. My husband was awake. He always rose early after returning from a trip, full of plans to reclaim the rhythm of the household. It used to comfort me. Now it just made my chest feel tight. Eventually, I got up, smoothed the sheets, and walked to the window. The yard was misty, the grass heavy with dew. It looked exactly as it had a week ago, a month ago. But I knew that I could never see it the same way again. Downstairs, the smell of coffee pulled me back into motion. I dressed without thinking, my movements slow but precise. When I entered the kitchen, my husband was already sitting at the table, reading the news on his phone. He looked up, smiled, and offered me my usual mug. I took it. The coffee was hot, strong, exactly how I liked it. He started talking about the day ahead, about grocery runs, a new client meeting scheduled for Monday, the need to finally clean the garage. I nodded where appropriate, murmured agreement, feigned attention. But every word he spoke echoed off something hollow inside me. A few minutes later, my son came down the stairs. He looked rested, composed, almost like the young man he used to be before everything shifted. He said good morning. My husband responded easily, without pause. I gave a faint smile and returned the greeting. No one mentioned the days that had passed. No one asked questions that couldn't be answered safely. We sat there for a while, the three of us, as if we were still just a family. But I felt every inch of the space between us like a bruise. Every glance, every silence, was loaded with what wasn't being said. After breakfast, my husband left to run errands. He kissed me on the cheek and promised to bring back flowers, like it was just another Saturday. I stood at the door and watched him drive away, the taillights disappearing down the street. I didn't wave. The moment the door shut behind me, the house changed again. It shrank. Or maybe I did. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was charged. Heavy. Familiar. He came into the room without a sound. I had my back to him, standing near the sink, pretending to rinse a plate that didn't need cleaning. "I'm leaving," he said. I didn't turn around. "Today?" He paused. "This afternoon." I set the plate down gently, not trusting my grip. "For good?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "For a while," he replied. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. I could feel his eyes on me, searching for a reaction. But I didn't give him one. "Not yet." "I already packed," he added. Didn't want to make a big thing out of it. "You don't need my permission," I said. "I'm not asking for it." Silence stretched between us again, like fabric pulled too tight. Something would tear eventually. I turned to face him. He looked the same. And entirely different. There was something in his posture, detachment, maybe. Or guilt. Or just the need to survive whatever this had become. "Where will you go?" I asked. "Somewhere quiet," he said. "I just need space." I nodded again. "All right." He hesitated before stepping closer. Not too close, just near enough that I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Will you tell him?" he asked. It took me a second to realize who he meant. "No," I said. "There's nothing to tell." His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't argue. He just stood there, looking at me like he wanted to say something important and didn't know how. "I don't hate you," I said, before I could stop myself. "I wish I did." He looked down, then back up. "I never meant for it to happen." Neither did I. We didn't touch. We didn't cry. There was nothing left to shatter. Only pieces waiting to be swept up later. He left an hour later. I didn't watch him pack the car. I stayed upstairs, in the hallway outside the bathroom, listening to the sound of bags being zipped, doors opening and closing, keys landing in a palm. When the door clicked shut for the last time, I sat down on the stairs and stared at the floor. My husband returned an hour after that. I heard his car, his keys in the lock, the door opening with a familiar rhythm. He called out for me. I answered. "Where is he?" he asked, stepping into the kitchen. "Gone," I replied. He raised his eyebrows. "Gone where?" He said he needed time. He didn't question it. Just nodded slowly and went to the fridge, pulling out a bottle of water. Maybe that's good, he said. Might help him reset. Maybe. We stood in silence for a while. He eventually broke it with a gentle smile. You okay? I smiled back. It was small, but real. I think so. That night, after dinner, we sat in the living room and watched something on television. I don't remember what it was. I wasn't really watching. I kept thinking about the way he looked when he walked out the door. The quiet in his movements. The weight in his eyes. When my husband fell asleep on the couch beside me, I stayed awake, staring into the flickering light of the screen. I got up slowly, walked to the hallway, and opened the door to my son's room. It was empty. The bed made. A folded sweatshirt on the desk. A framed photo turned face down. I stepped inside and stood there in the quiet, not touching anything. Just breathing. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed, placed my hands in my lap, and closed my eyes. I stayed there until morning.